Greenwich, Day 2. It's a marvelous place, Will said, glowing. I can see right over the harbor from my room. Who do the cottages belong to? A fisherman called Penhallow, said his uncle. Friend of Mary's. They must have been in the family for a while, judging by that. He waved at a large yellowed photograph over the fireplace, ornately framed, showing a solemn-looking Victorian gentleman in stiff collar and dark suit. Mr. Penhallow's granddaddy, I'm told, but the cottages are modernized, of course. They can be let either separately or together. We took both when Mary decided to invite the Drew kids. We'll all eat in here together. He waved at their cheerful room, a pattern of bookcases and armchairs and lamps, very new and old, very old, with a large solid table and 8 dignified high-backed chairs. Have you known Mr. Lyon a long time? Will said curiously. Year or two, Bill Stanton said, stretching in his armchair, ice clinking in a glass in his hand. Met him in Jamaica, didn't we, Fran? We were on holiday. I never did find out whether Mary was vacationing or working. Working, said his wife, busy setting the table. She was calm and fair, a tall, slow-moving person, not at all what Will had expected from an American. On some government survey, he's a professor at Oxford University, she said reverently to Will. A very, very clever man, and such a sweetie. He came all the way to Ohio to spend a few days with us last fall, when he was over giving a lecture at Yale. Ah, said Will thoughtfully. He was prevented from asking more questions by a sudden noise from the wall beside him. A large wooden door swung open, narrowly missing his back, revealing Merriman in the act of closing another identical door beyond it. This is where the 2 cottages connect, Merriman said, looking down at Will's surprise with a faint grin. They lock both doors if the 2 are let separately. Supper won't be long, said Fran Stanton in her soft drawl. As she spoke, a small, stout lady with a gray knot of hair came into the room behind her, bearing a tray rattling with cups and plates. Evening, Professor, she said, beaming at Merriman. Will liked her face instantly. All its lines seemed carved by smiling. Evening, Mrs. Penhallow. Well, Will, said his uncle, this is Mrs. Penhallow. She and her husband own these cottages. My nephew, Will. She smiled at him, setting down the tray. Welcome to Trewissick, my dear. We'll make sure you do have a wonderful holiday with those other 3 scallywags. Thank you, Will said. The dividing door burst open and the 3 Drews came piling in. Mrs. Penhallow, how are you? Have you seen Rufus about? Will Mr. Penhallow take us fishing this time? Is that awful Mrs. Polk still here, or her nephew? How's the white heather? Slowly, slowly, she said, laughing. Well, Barney said, how's Mr. Penhallow? He'm fine. Out on the boat now, of course. Now you just bide a moment while I get your supper. She bustled out. I can see you 3 know your way about the place, said Bill Stanton, his round face solemn. Oh, yes, said Barney complacently. Everyone knows us here. We shall have a lot of friends to see, said Simon rather too loudly with a quick sideways glance at Will. Yes, they've been here before. They stayed for 2 weeks last summer, said Merriman. Barney looked at him crossly. His great-uncle's craggy, deep-lined face was impassive. 3 weeks, said Simon. Was it? I beg your pardon. It's lovely to be back, Jane said diplomatically. Thank you very much for letting us come, Mrs. Stanton. You're very welcome. Will's uncle waved a hand in the air. Things have worked out fine. You 3 and Will can all have a great time together and leave us square old characters to ourselves. There was a very small silence. Then Jane said brightly, without looking at her brothers, Yes, we can. Will said to Simon, Why is it called Trewissick? Said Simon, taken aback. I really don't know. Do you know what it means, Mary? Look it up, said his great-uncle coolly. Research sharpens the memory. Will said diffidently, It's the place where they have the Greenwitch ceremony, isn't it? The Drews stared at him. Greenwich? What's that? Quite right, Merriman said. He looked down at them, a twitch beginning at one side of his mouth. It was in some book I read about Cornwall, Will said. Ah, Bill Stanton said. Will is quite an anthropologist. His father was telling me. Watch out. He's very big on ceremonies and such. Will seemed to look rather uncomfortable. It's just a sort of spring thing, he said. They make a leaf image and chuck it into the sea. Sometimes they call it the Greenwich, and sometimes King Mark's bride. Old custom. Oh, yes, like the carnival, Barney said dismissively. In the summer. Well, no, not quite. Will rubbed his ear, sounding apologetic. I mean, that Lammas carnival, it's more a sort of tourist affair, isn't it? Huh, said Simon. He's right, you know, Barney said. There were far more visitors than locals dancing about the streets last summer, including me. He looked at Will rather thoughtfully. Here we be, cried Mrs. Penhallow, materializing in the room with a tray of food almost as big as herself. Mrs. Penhallow must know all about the Greenwitch, said Fran Stanton in her soft American voice. Don't you, Miss Penhallow? It was a well-meaning remark intended to keep the peace in a situation which seemed to her a little prickly, but it had the reverse effect. The small, round Cornish woman set down her tray abruptly on the table, and the smile dropped from her face. I don't hold with talk of witches, she said politely, but finally, and went out again. Oh my, said Aunt Fran in dismay. Her husband chuckled. Yankee, go home, he said. What is this Greenwich affair, really, Mary? Simon said next morning. Will told you. All he knew was what he got out of some book. He's going to be a nuisance, I'm afraid, Barney said with a distaste. Merriman looked down at him sharply. Never dismiss anyone's value until you know him. Barney said, I only meant... Shut up, Barney, said Jane. The making of the Greenwich, said Merriman, is an old spring rite still celebrated here for greeting summer and charming a good harvest of crops and fish. In a day or two, as it happens, if you will all tread a little more gently, Jane might be able to watch it. Jane, said Barney. Only Jane? The making of the Greenwich is very much a private village affair, Merriman said. Jane thought his voice seemed strained, but his face was so near the roof of the narrow landing as to be lost in shadow. No visitors are normally allowed near, and of the locals, only women are allowed to be present. Good grief, said Simon in disgust. Jane said, surely we ought to be doing something about the Grail, Mary. I mean, after all, that's why we're here, and we haven't got long. Patience, Merriman said. In Trewissick, as you may recall, you never had to go looking for things to happen. They tended to happen to you. In that case, Barney said, I'm going out for a bit. He held the flat book in his hand unobtrusively against his side, but his great-uncle looked down from a height like a lighthouse. Sketching? He said. Uh-huh, said Barney reluctantly. The Drew's mother was an artist. Barney had always expressed horror at the idea of possessing the same talent, but in the last 12 months he had been disconcerted to find it creeping up on him. Try drawing this terrace from the other side, Merriman said, with the boats as well. All right, why? Oh, I don't know, said his great-uncle vaguely. It might come in handy. A present for someone. Perhaps even me. Crossing the quay, Barney passed a man sitting at an easel. It was a common enough sight in Trewissick, which, like many of the more picturesque villages in Cornwall, was much frequented by amateur painters. This particular artist had a very great deal of uncombed dark hair in a square, hefty frame. Barney paused and peeped over his shoulder. He blinked. On the easel was a wild abstract in crude, bright colors, bearing no visible relation at all to the scene in the harbor before them. It was unexpected, compared to the neat, anemic little watercolors that 19 out of 20 Trewissick harbor painters produced. The man was painting away like one demented. He said without pausing or turning around, Go away. Barney lingered for a moment. There was a real power in the painting, of a peculiar kind that made him oddly uneasy. Go away, the man said more loudly. I'm going, Barney said, moving one step backwards. Why green? Up in that top corner, though. Why not blue? Or a better kind of green? He was distressed by a lurid zigzag of a particularly nasty shade, a yellowy, mustard-like green, which drew the eye away from the rest of the picture. The man began to make a low rumbling noise like a growling dog, and the broad shoulders stiffened. Barney fled. He said to himself rebelliously, But that color was all wrong. On the far side of the harbor, he perched himself on a low wall with the steep, sliced rock of the headland at his back. The ill-tempered painter was invisible from there, hidden behind one of the inevitable piles of fish boxes on the quay. Barney sharpened a new pencil with his penknife and began to doodle. A sketch of a single fishing boat went badly, but a rough outline of the whole harbor began to turn out well, and Barney switched from pencil to an old-fashioned, soft-nibbed fountain pen, of which he was particularly fond. He worked fast then, pleased with the drawing, absorbed in its detail, sensing the awareness, still new this spring, that something of himself was going out through his fingers. It was a kind of magic. Coming up for air, he paused and held the drawing out at arm's length. And without a sound, a large dark-sleeved hand came from one side and seized the sketch pad. Before Barney could turn his head, he heard a noise of ripping paper. Then the pad was flung back at his feet, tumbling over itself on the ground. Footsteps ran. Barney leapt up with an indignant shout, and saw a man running away up the quayside, the page from the sketch pad flapping wide against the dark clothes. It was long-haired, bad-tempered painter he had seen on the quay. Hey! Barney yelled, furious. Come back! Without a glance behind, the man swung around the end of the harbor wall. He was a long way ahead, and the harbor path sloped uphill. Barney came tearing up, just in time to hear a car engine snarl into life and roar away. He whirled round the corner into the road and ran smack into someone walking up the hill. Ugh! Grunted the stranger as the breath was thumped out of him. Then his voice came back. Barney! It was Will Stanton. "A man," gasped Barney, staring around him. "Man in dark sweater." "A man came running up from the harbor just ahead of you," Will said, frowning. "He jumped into a car and drove off that way." He pointed down into the village. "That was him," Barney said. He peered resentfully at the empty road. Will looked too, fiddling with his jacket zipper. He said with astonishing force, "Stupid of me. Stupid. I knew there was something. Just not properly awake of thinking of." He shook his head, as if tossing something away from it. "What did he do?" "He's loopy. Mad." Barney could still scarcely speak for indignation. "I was sitting down sketching, and he just came up from nowhere, ripped the drawing out of my notebook, and belted off with it. What would any normal person do that for?" "Did you know him?" "No, well, that is, I'd seen him, but only today. He was sitting down on the quay, painting at an easel." Will smiled broadly. A silly smile, Barney thought. "Sounds as though he thought your picture was better than his." "Oh, come off it," Barney said impatiently. "Well, what was his picture like?" "Weird. Very peculiar." "There you are, then." "There I am not. It was weird. It was good, too, in a nasty sort of way." "Goodness me," Will said, looking vacant. Barney glared at his round face with its thick brown fringe of hair and felt more irritated than ever. He began trying to think of an excuse to get away. "He had a dog in the car," Will said absent-mindedly. "A dog? Barking like anything. Didn't you hear it? And jumping about. It nearly jumped out when he got in. Hope it didn't chew up your drawing." "I expect it did," Barney said coldly. "Lovely dog," Will said, in the same vague, dreamy tone. "One of those long-legged Irish setters, a super reddish color. No decent man would shut a dog like that up in a car." Barney stood stock-still looking at him. There was only one dog like that in Chewisik. He realized suddenly that directly across the road he could see a tall, familiar gray house. At the same moment, a gate at the side of the house swung open, and a man came out, a stout, elderly man with a short gray beard, leaning on a stick. Standing in the road, he put his fingers in his mouth and gave a sharp two-note whistle. Then he called, "Rufus! Rufus!" Impulsively, Barney ran towards him. "Captain Tom's? You are Captain Tom's, aren't you? Please look. I know Rufus. I helped look after him last summer, and I think someone's stolen him. A man went off with him in a car. A dark man with long hair, an awful man." He paused. "Of course, if it was someone you know." The man with the beard looked carefully at Barney. "No," he said slowly, deliberately. "I don't know a gentleman of that description. But you do seem to know Rufus. And by that hair of yours, I'd fancy you'd be maybe Merriman's youngest nephew. One of my tenants last year, eh? The children with the sharp eyes?" "That's right," Barney beamed. "I'm Barney." But something puzzled him about Captain Tom's manner. It was almost as if he were carrying on some other conversation at the same time. The old man was not even looking at him. He seemed to be gazing blankly at the surface of the water, seeing nothing, lost in his own mind. Barney suddenly remembered Will. He turned and saw to his astonishment that Will, too, was standing near him, staring vacantly at nothing, expressionless, as if listening. What was the matter with everybody? "This is Will Stanton," he said loudly to Captain Tom's. The bearded face did not change expression. "Yes," said Captain Tom gently. Then he shook his head and seemed to wake up. "A dark man, you said?" "He was a painter, very bad-tempered. I don't know who he was or anything, but Will saw him going off with a dog who sounded just like Rufus, and just outside your door." "I will make inquiries," Captain Tom said reassuringly. "But come in, both of you. You shall show your friend the gray house, Barnabas. I must find my key. I was busy in the garden." He felt in his pockets, patting at his jacket ineffectually, with the arm not leaning on the stick. Then they were at the front door. "Door's open," Will said sharply. His voice was crisp, very different from his inane babbling of a few moments before, and Barney blinked. Captain Tom's pushed the half-open door with a stick and stumped inside. "That's how the fellow got Rufus out. Opened the front door while I was round the back. I still can't find that key." He began fumbling in his pockets again. Following him in, Barney felt something rustle at his feet. He bent and picked up a sheet of white paper. "You didn't pick up your—" He stopped abruptly. The note was very short and in large letters. He could not help taking it in at a glance. He held it out to the captain, but it was Will, this strange, brisk Will, who took the paper and stood staring at it with the old man, the two heads close, young and old, brown and gray. The note was made of large black capital letters, cut from a newspaper and stuck very neatly together on the sheet. It said, "If you want your dog back alive, keep away from the Greenwitch." Chapter 3. Under the sunset sky, the ski was glass smooth. Long, slow rollers from the Atlantic, rippling like muscles beneath the skin, made the only sign of the great invisible strength of the ocean in all the tranquil evening. Quietly, the fishing boats moved about a broad fishtail wake spreading behind each one. Their engines chugged softly through the still air. Jane stood at the end of Kamar Head, on the crest of a granite outfall that tumbled its rocks 200 feet to the sea, and she watched them go. Toy boats, they seemed from there. The scatter of a fishing fleet that every week, every month, every year for endless years had been going out after the pilchard or the mackerel before dusk, and staying at the chase until dawn. Every year there were fewer of them, but still every year they went. The sun dropped at the horizon, a fat glowing ball spreading yellow light over the smooth sea, and the last boat crept out of Trewissick Harbor, its engine thumping like a muffled heartbeat in Jane's ears. As the last spreading lines of the boat's wake washed against the harbor wall in a final swift rush, the great sun dropped below the horizon, and the light of the April evening began very slowly to die. A small wind sprang up. Jane shivered and pulled her jacket around her. There was suddenly a coldness in the darkening air. As if in answer to the beginning breeze, a light starred up suddenly across Trewissick Bay on the headland opposite Kamar Head. At the same time, there was a sudden warmth behind Jane's back. She swung round and saw dark figures against tall flames, where a light had been set to the towering pile of driftwood and branches that had lain awaiting to become a bonfire for this one night. Mrs. Penhallow had told her that the two beacons would burn until the fishing boats came back, flames leaping all through the night until the dawn. Mrs. Penhallow, now there was a mystery. Jane thought again of the moment that afternoon when she had been alone in the living room flipping through a magazine, waiting for Simon. She had heard a nervous clearing of the throat, and there in the kitchen doorway Mrs. Penhallow was standing, round and rosy and unusually fidgety. "If you fancy coming to the making tonight, my dear, you're welcome," she said abruptly. Jane blinked at her. The making of the Greenwitch." The lilt of Mrs. Penhallow's Cornish accent seemed more marked than usual. "It do take all night. 'Tis a long business, and no outsiders allowed near, generally. But if you feel you'd like, you being the only female close to the professor and all," she waved the hand as if to catch words, "the women did agree it's all right, and I'd be happy to take you." "Thank you very much," said Jane, puzzled but pleased. Can Mrs. Stanton come too?" "No," Mrs. Penhallow said sharply. She added more gently as Jane's eyebrows went up. "She's a foreigner, you see. 'Tisn't fitting." Up on the headland, gazing at the fire, Jane remembered the flat finality of the words. She had accepted the pronouncement and, without even trying to explain the situation to Fran Stanton, had come out after supper to the headland with Mrs. Penhallow. Yet she still had been given no idea of what was to happen. Nobody had told her what the thing called the Greenwitch would be like, or how it would be made, or what would happen to it. She knew only that the business would occupy the whole night and end when the fishermen came home. Jane shivered again. Night was falling, and she was not overfond of the nights of Cornwall. They held too much of the unknown. Black shadows ran over the rocks around her, dancing and disappearing as the flames leapt. Instinctively, seeking company, Jane moved forward into the circle of bright light around the bonfire. Yet this, too, was unnerving, for now the other figures moved to and fro at the edge of the darkness and out of sight, and she felt suddenly vulnerable. She hesitated, frightened by the tension of the air. "Come, my dear," said Mrs. Penhallow's soft voice beside her. "Come by here." There was a hint of urgency in her tone. Hastily she took Jane by the arm and led her aside. "Time for the making," she said. "You want to keep out of the way if you can." Then she was gone again, leaving Jane alone near a group of women busying themselves with something not yet visible. Jane found a rock and sat down, warmed by the fire. She watched. Scores of women were there, of all ages, the younger ones in jeans and sweaters, and the rest in sturdy dark shirts, long as overcoats, and high, heavy boots. Jane could see a big pile of stones, each the size of a man's head, and a far higher pile of green branches, hawthorn, she thought, too leafy to be intended for the fire, but she did not understand the purpose of either of these. Then one tall woman moved out before the rest, and held out one arm high in the air. She called out something Jane could not understand, and at once the woman set to working in a curious ordered way in small groups. Some would take a branch, strip it of leaves and twigs, and test it for its flexibility. Others, then, would take the branch and in some swift, practiced way weave it together with others into what began very slowly to emerge as a kind of frame. After a while, the frame began to show signs of becoming a great cylinder. The cleaning and bending and tying went on for a long time. Jane shifted restlessly. The leaves on some of the branches seemed to be of different shape from the hawthorn. She was not close enough to see what they might be, and she did not intend to move. She felt she would only be safe here, half invisible on her rock, unnoticed, watching from a little way off. At her side, suddenly she found the tall woman who had seen the others lead her. Bright eyes looked down at her out of a thin face, framed by a scarf tied under the chin. "Jane Drew, it is," the woman said, with a Cornish accent that sounded oddly hard. "One of those who found the Grail?" Jane jumped. The thought of the Grail was never fully out of her mind, but she had not linked it with that strange ceremony here. The woman, however, did not mention it again. "Watch for the Greenwitch," she said conversationally. It was like a greeting. The sky was almost black now, with only a faint rim of the glow of daylight. The lights of the two bonfires burned brightly on the headlands. Jane said hastily, clutching at this companionship against the lonely dark, "What are they doing with those branches?" "Hazel for the framework," the woman said. "Rowan for the head. Then the body is of hawthorn boughs and hawthorn blossoms, with the stones within for the sinking. And those who are crossed or barren, or who would make any wish, must touch the Greenwitch then before she be put to cliff." "Oh," Jane said. "Watch for the Greenwitch," said the woman pleasantly again, and moved away. Over her shoulder she said, "You may make a wish too, if you like. I will call you at the right time." Jane was left wondering and nervous. The women were busier now, working steadily, singing in a strange kind of wordless humming. The cylinder shape grew more distinct, closer woven, and they carried the stones and put them inside. The head began to take shape, a huge head, long, squarish, without features. When the framework was done, they began weaving it into green branches, starred with white blossoms. Jane could smell the heavy sweetness of the hawthorn. Somehow it reminded her of the sea. Hours went by. Sometimes Jane dozed, curled beside her rock. Whenever she woke, the framework seemed to look exactly as it had before. The work of weaving seemed endless. Mrs. Penhallow came twice with hot tea from a flask. She said anxiously, "Now, if you do feel you've had enough, my dear, you just say. Easy to take you along home." "No," Jane said, staring at the great leafy image with its cord of steady workers. She did not like the Greenwitch. It frightened her. There was something menacing in its broad, squat shape. Yet it was hypnotic, too. She could scarcely take her eyes off it. She had always thought of witches as being female, but she could feel no she quality in the Greenwitch. It was unclassifiable, like a rock or a tree. The bonfire still burned, fed carefully with wood. Its warmth was very welcome in the chill night. Jane moved away to stretch her stiff legs and saw inland a faint grayness beginning to lighten the sky. Morning would be coming soon, a misty morning. Fine drops of moisture were flicking at her face already. Against the lightning sky, she could see terrific standing stones, 5 of them, ancient skyward pointing fingers, halfway along Kamar Head. She thought, "That's what Greenwich is like. It reminds me of the standing stones." When she turned back again towards the sea, the Greenwich was finished. The women had drawn away from the great figure. They sat by the fire, eating sandwiches and laughing and drinking tea. As Jane looked at the huge image that they had made out of leaves and branches, she could not understand their lightness. For she knew suddenly, out there in the cold dawn, that this silent image somehow held within it more power than she had ever sensed before in any creature or thing. Thunder and storms and earthquakes were there, and all the force of the earth and sea. It was outside time, boundless, ageless, beyond any line drawn between good and evil. Jane stared at it, horrified, and from its sightless head the Greenwitch stared back. It would not move, or seem to come alive. She knew that. Her horror came not from fear, but from the awareness she suddenly felt from the image of an appalling, endless loneliness. Great power was held only in great isolation. Looking at the Greenwich, she felt a terrible awe, and a kind of pity as well. But the awe from her amazement at so inconceivable a force was stronger than anything else. "You feel it, then?" The leader of the women was beside her again. The hard, flat words were not a question. "A few women do, or girls, very few. None of those there, not one." She gestured contemptuously at the cheerful group beyond. "But one who has held the Grail in her hands may feel many things. Come, make your wish." "Oh, no." Jane shrank back instinctively. In the same moment, a cluster of 4 young women broke away from the crowd and ran to the broad, shadowy leaf image. They were shaking with giggles, calling to one another. One, larger and noisier than the rest, rushed up and clasped the hawthorn sides that stretched far above her head. "Send us all the rich husbands, Greenwitch, pray thy," she shouted. "Or else send her young Jim Tregony," bellowed another, shrieking with laughter. They all ran back to the group. "See there," said the woman, "no harm comes to the foolish, which is most of them, and therefore none to those with understanding. Will you come?" She walked over to the big silent figure, laid a hand on it, and said something that Jane could not hear. Nervously Jane followed. As she came close to the Greenwich, she felt again the unimaginable force it seemed to represent, but again the great loneliness too. Melancholy seemed to hover about it like a mist. She put out her hand to grasp a hawthorn bough, Anne paused. "Oh dear," she said impulsively. "I wish you could be happy." She thought, as she said it, how babyish. When you could have wished for anything, even getting the Grail back, even if it's all a lot of rubbish, you could at least have tried. But the hard-eyed Cornish woman was looking at her with an odd, surprised kind of approval. "A perilous wish," she said, "for where one may be made happy by harmless things, another may find happiness only in hurting. But good may come of it." Jane could think of nothing to say. She felt suddenly extremely silly. Then she thought she heard a muffled throbbing sound out at sea. She swung round. The woman, too, was looking outward at a gray streak of horizon where none had been before. Out on the dark sea, lights were flickering, white and red and green. The first fishermen were coming home. Afterwards, Jane remembered little of that long waiting time. The air was cold. Slowly, slowly, the fishing boats came closer over the stone gray sea glimmering in the cold dawn. And then, when at last they neared the wharf, the village seemed to sputter into life. Lights and voices woke on the jetties. Engines coughed. The air was filled with shouting and laughing and a great bustle of unloading. And over all of it, the gulls wheeled and screamed, early woken from thievery, eddying in a great white cloud round the boats to dive for discarded fish. Afterwards, Jane found herself remembering the gulls most of all. Up from the harbor, when the unloading was done, and lorries gone to market, and boxes gone into the little canning factory, up from the harbor came a procession of the fishermen. There were others, too, factory men and mechanics, and shopkeepers and farmers, all men of Trewissick. But the dark jerseyed fishermen, shadow-eyed, bristle-chinned, weary, smelling of fish, led the long crowd. They came along the headland, calling cheerfully to the women. No meeting could have been less romantic, Jane thought, up there in the sleepless cold, under the dead gray light of the dawn. And yet there was a great light-heartedness among them all. The bonfire still burned, a last stock of wood newly blazing. The men gathered round it, rubbing their hands in a tumult of deep voices that sounded harsh in Jane's ears after the lighter chattering of the women all night. High and low in the sky the gulls drifted, uncertain, hopeful. Amongst all the bustle stood the Greenwitch, vast and silent, a little diminished by light and noise, but still brooding, ominous. Despite all the raucous exchanges tossed between the men and women, there was a curious respectfulness towards the strange, leafy image, a clear reluctance to make any fun of the Greenwich. Jane found that for some reason this left her feeling relieved.